There was a subtle change in the 90s to the early 2000s, the internet era, that gave governments more power in deciding election outcomes and the people less power. It has to do with gerrymandering, but also a movement for election transparency. These two are related. And in a little plot twist, I'm going to show you how the national parties distracted our attention from the solution to gerrymandering. So what happened in the 90s to 2000 era? Well, the National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA, took effect beginning in 1995. It was also called the Motor Voter Act, and it required states to lower the bar and make voter registration easier, including offering it in DMV locations and other government offices, and with mail-in registration options. It also expanded public disclosure requirements about state and local voter registrations, and this is a key detail we're going to come back to later. The Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, in 2002 expanded the disclosure requirements by requiring centralized state-level voter registration databases. We did not always have those. So how did elections work before states had centralized voter registration databases? I mean, if you show up to vote, how would anyone know if you're eligible to vote? Are you a United States citizen? Are you of voting age? Are you a local resident? It turned out they could verify these things because they maintained local records, whether in the county, the city, or even at the precinct level. And it worked fine. They did not need to go to Washington, D.C. or the State Records Division to verify that you were indeed a local resident citizen eligible to vote. However, if there were any issues with the more local record keeping, registration, and administration of elections, this tended to create pressure for the federal government to intervene. In particular, if there was any exclusionary bias alleged on the basis of minority status, this of course got the attention of civil rights groups. Incidents could have been handled on a case-by-case basis through the judiciary, but over time the pressure for federal legislation grew. Although the argument was to increase access and promote efficiency, NVRA and HAVA providing incentives and regulations was actually a way of using federal tax dollars to increase voter turnout with targeted demographics. The HAVA offered federal funds for upgrading election equipment in exchange for compliance. But there was and is a danger accompanying these new regulations and disclosure requirements. I shouldn't have to remind you in our data-hungry era that information is power. The state doesn't need to know your private information for you to be able to vote. Only the unit that administers an election needs to know you are eligible to vote. And that is the only information they need or have a right to know. Once you can prove that you are eligible and that you have only voted once in a given election in which you are eligible to vote, they don't need to gather any more information about you. It turns out this information is the key to gerrymandering, out-of-state money to swing your local elections, and even foreign interference. Are you willing to give up information such as party affiliation or other demographic information that might identify you as being more or less likely to vote a certain way? This gives away some of the most crucial strategic information to parties in power to redistrict in ways that limit your right to representation. Article 1, Section 4 has been cited in response to a ruling by a Utah district court, which held that the state's Proposition 4 passed in 2018, allowing the creation of a supposedly independent redistricting commission, supposedly to end gerrymandering, was valid and could overrule the legislature's subsequent decision to redistrict differently, allegedly in a way that favored the Republican Party unfairly and perhaps in violation of the law. Article 1, Section 4 says, "The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators." What this citation to Article 1, Section 4 gets right is that the legislature alone has power to draw up district boundaries. The people at large do not. States that allow ballot initiatives to change laws naturally run into this kind of crisis of authority because they effectively have two competing legislatures. The supremacy clause of the federal constitution should prevail here because otherwise that would amount to denying plainly worded constitutional guarantees. The state legislature, as I understand it, has the sole power of determining districts for congressional elections. So the Utah district judge is wrong about this one. Article 1, Section 4 does not say that the federal government has blanket authority to change the way voters register or who can vote within the states, or attach other strings to the voter registration process. It only specifies that Congress may by law alter such regulations, meaning as to the times, places, and manner of holding elections, but only for congressional seats. It confers no authority to affect any other election, whether it be presidential, state, or local. There are federalism issues with the NVRA and HAVA. They exceed constitutional bounds by mandating a blanket rule for statewide voter registration and disclosure requirements. The manner of holding elections does not include blanket power to alter voter demographics or eligibility requirements. And here's why that matters. Disclosure conveys information, or in other words, a signal. And in order to gerrymander, you need a signal. What is that signal? Race, age, education level, party affiliation, income? Party lines are the most common and probably the most influential that are used to draw boundaries for districts. If you take that away, you solve the problem of gerrymandering. Legislators could still draw weird squiggles on a map, but best case, it would just be random guessing. By the way, have you started to wonder why almost every federal questionnaire asks you to volunteer this kind of information? But the parties, by their very names and the exclusive emphasis on Article 1, Section 4, are distracting us from something more important. Article 1, Section 4 says that the state legislatures have authority to choose the times, places, and manner of the election of the congressional candidates. However, there are two important things that they are not authorized to change. Article 1, Section 2 reads, "The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature." This is a prescription on the method, the manner, if you will, of choosing the House representatives. They're not allowed to change this election method. Article 1, Section 3 says, "The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years, and each Senate shall have 1 vote." So for the House, it's supposed to be a popular vote, and for the Senate, it's supposed to be by the legislature. Why does this matter? Because the Constitution originally prescribed different election methods for different offices. The states were never free to choose to make those election methods the same. If you make them the same, you erase the differences between House representatives and senators. They no longer provide a check on each other. This is a check and a balance in the Constitution that was erased. Congress changed this in 1913 by replacing the legislative elections for senators with direct popular vote elections. This is actually extremely important because all of your senators are actually Democrats with a lowercase d, just like the House representatives. The parties mask the fact that this check was dismantled by appropriating the names Democrat and Republican, which originally referred to the different election methods which were used to keep the government in check. The check has been taken off from the government and placed on us. The reason why this acts as a check is because if you have people who are elected using different methods, their accountability to the people is different. You would have the House representatives who represent the people at large, represented by a unit of population, and then you have and they're elected by a popular vote, whereas you have the senators, which are elected by the legislature, and so they represent the state. And so those competing interests will tend to cancel each other out wherever they disagree. That check is gone now. And so there's really no difference anymore between a senator and a House representative, other than the term of his office and a few other nitty-gritties. But as to their motives, this is hugely important. This was why the Senate and the House are supposed to be different. This is why we're supposed to have a bicameral, meaning having 2 houses of the legislature, of Congress, is so that they act as a check on each other. That's gone now. When Donald Trump said that the Utah judiciary is threatening to take away our congressional advantage, he is referring to the partisan majorities in Congress. Partisan majorities in Congress were never meant to be a thing. They are unconstitutional. So I am opposed to things like the NVRA and HAVA that require disclosure of information beyond sensible bounds. Government entities have no business knowing how you are likely to vote. They only need to know that you are eligible to vote in the elections that they administer. Voters in a given election have a right to vet their peers in that election. People outside of that sphere have no business obtaining personally identifying information or information about voter sympathies, preferences, or any other data that could be used in this way. The government that administers the election also has no business asking for or receiving information about party affiliation or other demographic details, because those are the ingredients in the recipe for gerrymandering. You take those away, and gerrymandering will also go away. Of course, you could also have rules like districts have to be simple shapes, like convex and contiguous regions, and this would reduce the government's ability to draw up possibly unfair contortions. If you want to know who had the most brilliant plan for districts, that would be Joseph Smith. He delivered the inspired model based on wards and townships of limited predictable sizes and shapes based on the Plat of Zion. This would do much to limit gerrymandering. Anyway, the legislature is supposed to have districting powers, but it is not supposed to have access to information that would enable them to turn that to partisan advantage. And the election methods for senators and House representatives ought to be distinct. So keep your information safe with the right amount of disclosure. Don't vote along party lines. This is also one reason why I disagree with Phil Lyman on his lawsuit against Spencer Cox to get him to conform with the National Voter Registration Act. There have been some failures to follow legal procedure there, where Spencer Cox and Deidre Henderson, who administered her own election, have withheld information about signatures that were alleged to have been gathered, but are likely fraudulent because they're not delivering that information according to the requirements of the law. Phil is invoking the National Voter Registration Act as a way to force them to disclose that information, but unfortunately, the NVRA has overdisclosure baked into it. That is to say, that information would become too public. So the people who participate in that election and the candidates themselves have a right to know and a need to know that the election was administered fairly and that everybody who voted in it was actually eligible to vote and that those votes are valid and authentic. But people outside don't really have any business obtaining that information. Voter party affiliations and birth years and stuff like that really doesn't belong as public information. You only use that information. You only really need to use that information just to verify that the individual is indeed eligible to vote. That's it. And that's the way it used to be. That's the way that information used to be kept local. And it seems to me that the purpose of the NVRA and HAVA is to get that information to be over-disclosed, which invites out-of-state funding to come and manipulate your election outcomes because they have that fine-grained, targeted information to know where to advertise and where to campaign. And it also invites gerrymandering. It enables it. And it also invites foreign influence, because if you make these voter lists public, then there's nothing stopping people from other countries exploiting that information to manipulate your elections. So if you want to keep elections secure, you will keep that information local. You will keep it in the hands of only the people who need to know it. And you just categorically won't disclose information like party affiliation or who you voted for. And please, please, please don't vote along party lines. That's the key to making this whole manipulation scheme work. So keep our elections secure. Keep that information local. To learn more about the dangers of overdisclosure and the control the parties have taken over our election systems through the erasure of checks and balances, check out my playlist here.